Good evening. My name is Erin O'Donnell. I'm a member of the Awake leadership team, and I'm editor of Awake's weekly blog. I have the real honor of introducing our guests this evening. Let's start with Dr. Stephanie Krehbiel, who is co-founder and executive director of Into Account, an organization that originally started to support victim survivors of sexual abuse in the Mennonite Church USA, and now works with survivors in all Christian contexts. Stephanie's doctoral training involved ethnography and oral history, and she works with survivors who want to tell their stories in public forums. Last May, she was contacted by a survivor of David Haase's abuse, who learned about Into Account from a colleague. Stephanie spent many hours listening to and supporting that woman, and in the weeks that followed, more women contacted Into Account to make their own reports of sexual assault, grooming, and spiritual abuse by David Haase. Before Stephanie met these women, she was completely unfamiliar with Haase, who is the prolific composer of many popular contemporary hymns played in Catholic churches, including Blessed Are They, We Are Called, and The Mass of Light. Once Into Account had received multiple reports of sexual abuse by Haase, Stephanie's organization emailed several Catholic dioceses and liturgical music publishers in late spring 2020, sharing the allegations. News outlets began publishing stories, which led more women to come forward to make reports. To date, more than 50 people have come to Into Account to report abuse by Haase. We look forward to hearing more about this important work, Stephanie. Thank you for being here. We are also joined this evening by Margaret Hillman. She's a wife and mother of 2 adult children and lives in Florida, where she cantors for 2 Catholic parishes. Margaret began singing in her parish choir as a teenager in New England. She first met David Haase at a liturgical music workshop when she was 14 years old, and encountered him again after a concert when she was 18. He invited her to Minnesota, where he's based, to visit colleges that offered liturgical music majors. In her report to Into Account, Margaret describes how Haase sexually assaulted her on that visit. She'll talk tonight about the real challenges of singing his music. Thank you, Margaret, for your courage in being with us tonight. Finally, I'd like to introduce you to Laurie Delgatto-Whitten. Laurie was invited by David Haase to serve on the staff of his music ministry, Alive Camp for Teenagers in St. Paul, Minnesota. Laurie was a 20-year veteran of Catholic youth ministry when she joined the team. She left after just 2 years over concerns about some camp practices, which she described as, quote, manipulative, or just downright poor pastoral care of teenagers. When she heard the news about Haase last summer, Laurie connected with several victim survivors and began to advocate for them. This work involved helping Margaret Hillman contact all Catholic dioceses in the US to ask them to stop playing Haase's music, because hearing this music during liturgies can be re-traumatizing to Haase's victims and to other survivors of sexual abuse. Laurie, thank you so much for being here. And with that, let's turn now to Awake Milwaukee's Executive Director, Sarah Larson, who will help guide our conversation tonight.
Thank you so much. I know everyone is eager to get to hear these speakers, and we are so grateful for each of them being here tonight. I've said this before, and I really mean it. We are really honored to be able to host all 3 of you and lift up your voices. There's a lot that we would like to talk about tonight, but we thought it would probably be helpful to have a little bit of basic information of this story for those of you who might not be familiar with it. So we're going to ask Stephanie to get us started by giving us just a bit of an overview, beginning with when she first heard about David Haase. So we'll go ahead and let Stephanie take it from there.
Thank you so much. Thanks to all the Awake Milwaukee leadership for having me to do this, and to everybody for coming. This is an amazing turnout. And I also would like to give a special thank you to all of the survivors who are here. Just know that you're cherished, and I'm so grateful that you're attending. I think maybe the best way to introduce this is just to kind of narrate what happened from my perspective as the director of Into Account. Sometime around February of 2020, we launched an online report form. It was before the pandemic started, but it was kind of fortuitous because it's gotten some pretty heavy use during the pandemic. And a few months later, we were all kind of trying to get into our work rhythm with the pandemic having started. And just to give you a little bit of quick background about like what Into Account's work is like, we have a staff of about 4 people. We are a very scrappy, small nonprofit. We're very reliant on donations. And we all work remotely because we work wherever in the country, and sometimes in Canada, people need our help. We started out working primarily with Mennonites, but we never were completely focused on Mennonites. Quickly it just became apparent that there were a number of people who wanted the kinds of services that we offered. But we had never really worked all that much with Catholic survivors before, although we certainly got a lot of help and initial training from SNAP. So shout out to the SNAP folks here. And so a lot of what I knew about Catholic institutions, I learned from SNAP advocates. So around late April, early May, I got a report, and once I made phone contact with that particular survivor, we talked a lot, and she was clear that she was not. she was like, this is a systemic issue. Like, I know lots of other people who have been harmed by this man. And so I spoke with, she networked me with other survivors and also some people who had witnessed things that were troubling. And, I went to my colleagues and it was like, have you ever heard of this David Haas guy? He seems to be kind of famous. And one of my colleagues was like, that name sounds kind of familiar. Eventually we did recognize some hymns. Some of his hymns were in the Mennonite hymnals that we were. Okay, I'm sorry. Somehow I got a message that the host had muted me, but then it let me unmute me. I'm sorry about that. Anyway, so we were like, okay, what can we do? Because the survivors we were talking to were describing a systemic issue whereby it's not that nobody ever reported David Haas to anyone. It's not that nobody ever said that they were being abused. It's that they weren't believed, or it wasn't seen as a big deal, or they were intimidated, often by Haas himself. So we decided that the best way to move forward, because the purpose, when people report to us as survivors, we start with, once we've established what's happening with this person, what actually happened to them, the first thing we want to know is what do you want to do? What are your goals? Because as advocates, that's our entry point. Usually when people come to talk to us, they've had some bad experiences with institutional processes, or they've tried to report and nobody has taken them seriously. That was very much the case here. And so we just decided, let's build a list of all the people who have business relationships with him of some sort, and contact them and describe what has been reported to us. And I want to emphasize that that is not a step that an organization like mine can take lightly or easily. We don't do that very often. We don't do it unless we're 100% certain that people are telling us the truth, which, you know, despite a lot of popular perceptions, people very, very, very rarely lie about these things. But we want to make sure, because we know we're going to be legally threatened when we do something like that. So we sent out a letter, and it was probably to about 75 email addresses. You know, the people that we were working with a lot, some of them were within the music industry. And so they knew who would it be impactful to contact. They knew. So we sent it out to about 75 people, about 50 organizations, including archdioceses, including major publishers, including entities like the LA Religious Education Congress, where Haas assaulted a number of women. And you know, and then we kind of waited to see what would happen, because we just recommended some resources to them and said, we really encourage you to take this seriously. We really encourage you to do some research about what a survivor-centered response to this information would be. And we're happy to talk to you if you would like some orientation there. We didn't get all that much response initially, but we did start hearing from survivors. And the thing is that Haas has many, he's victimized many women within the industries that he's active. Which is why so many of the people who have reported to us are cantors, music directors, musicians. So they heard about the email that we sent to everybody. Of course, Haas immediately threatened to sue us, and we've learned to ignore that kind of thing, and we did. But we started hearing from survivors, and finally, I think it was after about 2 weeks, I think maybe I had heard from maybe 10 survivors at that point, 10 to 12. I contacted the leadership at SNAP, and I said, this is a Catholic case, could you do a press release to amplify our letter? And they were great. They worked with us, and that's when it kind of exploded. So at the point that SNAP did the press release, then Catholic Press picked it up not long after. National Catholic Reporter did some stories, Catholic News Agency did some stories, and that's when survivors started reporting to us almost on a daily basis for about a month. So we were contacted by the New York Times. I'm still not sure exactly how they found out about it, but we ended up having a story in the New York Times in August. And there got to be a point when, one of the difficult things about media coverage of sexual abuse is that the media has to be so careful about what they say for liability purposes. So if you read any story about sexual violence, unless it's somebody who's already been convicted, it's very likely that what's described isn't as bad as what actually happened, because legal departments and editors really curtail what reporters are actually able to write about sexual abuse, because there's so much fear of liability. And I just say that not to comment on how it should be or shouldn't be, it just is that way. So after a number of media stories that were good, but also felt it's hard as a survivor to continually see what actually happened to you, being kind of understated and not represented as violent as it was, or as life disrupting as it was. More and more survivors were asking us, can you write something? And so we We ended up writing a report. Our whole staff worked on this. We wrote a report that basically summarized the patterns that we saw over the course of, I think at that point we had 44 reports. That's what you'll see in the report that we have on our website on David Haas. And, you know, and then to not just to tell we have a lot of individual survivor stories attached to that report, but we also try to help people understand why and how it happened in there. Like, what were the spiritual components? What were the institutional components? What was happening theologically that allowed people to not think that this was a big deal? So that we put out in October, and we have continued to get reports since then. So yeah, now we are at over 50 victims who have reported to us directly. And I continue to be in contact with many of them. You know, I'm sure that there will be questions about whether there's going to be criminal or civil litigation, and that is an open-ended question that I'm not comfortable answering with very much concreteness, but I can talk about some of the obstacles to that. But a lot of this process for Into Account has been moving from supporting, I mean, we usually support 10 to 15 survivors at the, you know, around the same time. We're usually working with people on some sort of institutional process. And now it's more like 75. And it's not as though everything is urgent every day, but this particular case, I guess one thing I would want to add is that there's nothing about David Haas's abuse or his profile as a perpetrator, or the fact that he's a well-known artist and a perpetrator. None of these things are exceptional or out of the range of what I've seen before as an advocate. What is stunning about this case is the scale. Just the fact that over 50 women have reported to a group of people who aren't Catholic, who had no name recognition before, you know, within the circles that Haas was active before this happened. What that says to me, that in addition to evaluating the patterns that people have reported, is that there are many, many, many more victims. I think this man has abused hundreds of women, and I think most of the victims would agree. That is, all signs point to that. So it's a gravely, I mean, it's a very serious case that is going to be haunting people who love his music, you know, for the foreseeable future. There's just the youngest victim that has reported to us is 23 right now, and the oldest victim that has reported to us is 65 right now. So that's over 3 generations of women. The first report, or the oldest report that we have, is from 1975, which is before I was born. And the most recent one is from 2020. So there's remarkable consistency to what people report. So that's the scale of what we're dealing with. And that's probably enough to get started.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Thanks for kind of giving us the story of how this all came out and Into Account's role in it. I wanted to ask you one more question before we move on to Margaret. This, you know, as you said, you're not a Catholic organization, and you hadn't worked with a lot of Catholic survivors before. Why do you think so many survivors came to you instead of some kind of Catholic setting where they could report these things? Why do you think they trusted Into Account?
Well, I've thought about that a lot, obviously. I think there are a few things that are factors. One of them is that we're all experts and we knew what to do. We knew not to immediately call up the perpetrator and ask him if these women are telling the truth. which is what a lot of other people did. And of course he lied because, you know, that's the thing that perpetrators do. But it was also that I think the fact that we weren't Catholic made it easier. One of the things that has really gotten in the way of any accountability for David Haas is that he has tremendous power within the industries that he has used to abuse women. And he has a record of being extremely retaliatory when people try to do anything to hold him to account. So, you know, there are a handful of people who knew some part of what was happening, but particularly those who were survivors were in no position to do anything about it. And those who were in positions to do something about it clearly weren't going to. So at that point, you know, people start reporting to us, and we have nothing to lose in these communities. So we're able to weather Haas threatening us, because he can threaten to sue us for defamation, but then we're like, okay, well, we have to protect people's identities, but here are our records. He doesn't want that. We know why perpetrators threaten to sue advocates and survivors. It's because they want us to be scared and quiet. Well, we didn't have any reason to be quiet. We didn't have any professional investments. And, you know, a perpetrator attacking us as a group of people who are devoted to preventing sexual abuse is not the same attack on our credibility that it would be on a musician who's part of an industry where David Haas has a lot of power. So we had power in a particular way, even though in a lot of other ways, we don't have a lot of power. We're underfunded, we're understaffed, and we don't have a ton of influence, but we could take risks that other people who had been reported to couldn't or weren't willing to take. So that's one thing. The other thing is just word of mouth. Once a number of survivors had reported to us, and many of the women who have been victimized know each other because, you know, industry worlds are small. The liturgical music world is small. And they knew of other people who had been victimized, and they let them know, hey, these folks are getting reports. And so, I mean, I think that's a lot of the reason why. The media exposure certainly helped, but the media didn't really go out of its way to make it easy for people to report to us, because that's not necessarily their job. So yeah, I think that our removal from the world in which this stuff was happening was really advantageous in a lot of ways, although I worry that the word still isn't out to enough people.
Well, thank you for your help getting the word out, and we're hoping that this conversation tonight is part of that as well. We're going to continue the rest of this conversation in kind of more of a fluid conversational style. So I'm going to talk to Margaret for a little bit here and let her tell her story a little bit, but we'll go back and forth. So Margaret, we know that you're a survivor of abuse by David Haas. Can you tell us how you met him?
I was living in Massachusetts at the time, and my diocese had a very active NPM chapter, and I met him at a cantor workshop when I was 14. I then saw him, ran into him several times over the years, either at concerts, workshops, conventions. We have a lot of mutual friends, so he's been somebody who's always kind of been in the circle of humans that I know and love.
So how did you view David Haas when you were a teenager? I think that people who don't know the liturgical ministry world, it's kind of hard to understand what his status was there. But so how did you see him when you were a teenager?
I saw him very much as a mentor, as I had several really good mentors. I learned a lot about cantoring from him. I listened to his music. I admired him. I liked to go to his concerts. I often go with my mom. My music director was just over the moon about him. He could do no wrong. So I was surrounded by a lot of people who kind of put him up on a pedestal.
Hmm.
And certainly at the conventions and things, there was a lot of that.
Yeah. So thank you for being willing to share this in whatever amount of detail or not that you are comfortable with. But, so how did Haas first reach out to you individually, and where did things go from there?
When I was 18, so 4 years later, my mom and I went to a concert in Rhode Island, and he invited us to the after party after. And we ended up talking about, I had left the conservatory where I was studying. I was looking for my next school and what I was going to do. And he knew I was a cantor because seeing me at all these workshops, and told me he taught at St. Kate's, which is evidently he never taught at St. Kate's, but that he was very, very involved there, and that he would send me, he wanted my information so he could send me information about the school. So we exchanged phone numbers. A couple of weeks later, he called me, and then he called me somewhat regularly until eventually he invited me to come out to visit St. Kate's.
And so what happened when you went out to visit there?
And at the concert, I should go back. I'm still going back. On the way to the car, my mother went to the car first, and we were just talking on the way to the parking lot, and he just spun me around and kissed me. No warning. No, I mean, as an 18-year-old, a 28-year-old guy is an old guy. And it was not, there was no notice. It was just like happened. So a few months go by. He's calling regularly. He's talking about the school. There's no other like relationship building things or the kind of things I would see as normal before what he was asking for when I was in Minnesota happened. He, first day was totally normal. We went around St. Paul. We went to the cathedral, to St. Kate's, to a bookstore where he was like, look at all my books on display at this bookstore. I think that was in downtown, either St. Paul or Minneapolis. We went to where Mary Tyler Moore threw her hat up. All the silly things you do. We went out to dinner. He dropped me off at the hotel where I was staying. Totally above board. The next day he had to go to a funeral, and I was left on my own all day. At some point he called, and I had gone out, and he was angry I left the room. I wasn't really the kind of person to sit in a hotel room for 12 hours staring at the wall, so I went exploring. So we agreed we'd have dinner. He brought dinner in, I just remember it was a brown paper bag, and I think there were French fries involved. He brought dinner. He didn't bring me out for dinner. And being a college student, hanging out in a room, eating dinner wasn't too weird, because that's kind of what poor college students often do. After we were done eating was when he made further demands. And people have asked me, why did you let that happen? Or how did he convince you? But it was more a matter of, I was 18. I was 1,000 miles away from home. I was basically alone, and I was in a room with a very angry man who was accusing me of leading him on. And this is what adults do in adult relationships. I think that's about as far as I'm going to go in this mixed company, but my story is on the Into Account report.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you for sharing that. So when you went back home, were you able to tell anyone, to talk to your mom or anyone about it?
I really wasn't. My mother was emotionally fragile after a divorce, a bad divorce, which is a common thread with a lot of us, that people came from broken homes or troubled homes. So I wasn't something I felt I could talk to my mother. My grandmothers would have just said, well, why were you there in the first place? In the 80s, there was a lot of, as a mature adult, I can see that none of it was my fault. But as an 18-year-old, I left going, wow, that was really dreadful. Never have anything to do with older men. I kind of stuffed it. in a corner until I saw the SNAP report.
So after not talking about it for so many years, what made you to decide to talk to Into Account and to, take more action at that point?
Because a friend, somebody I now consider a friend on Twitter that I followed, posted the SNAP report, the SNAP press release from Into Account. And I read it, and I immediately saw consistencies with my story and immediately started having flashbacks. It took me a couple of weeks before I actually sent my report. And at the time, I think I was like number 14, and now there's more than 50 of us. Oh, and again, a lot of our stories have overlapping, like, oh yeah, we went to the bookstore too, or we, this happened or that happened. It's very textbook, like there was a playbook.
So what was your goal when you came to Account and decided to make that report? Why did you decide to do that at that point?
To bring his behavior to light, to the more of us who come forward, the more people who feel safe to come forward. I don't do things like this because it's fun, or I like the attention, or I want to tell this story to anybody ever. But if it can help one person come forward, then it's worth it. Then it's worth it for me.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for being willing to do that. So, as a longtime music minister, you've sung David Haase's songs many times over the years, but something changed for you last summer, and it felt very difficult to sing his songs. And can you tell us about why that is, and what happens? What's it like for you if you're asked to sing one of his songs?
It's the totality of it. It has been causing me, I had gotten off, I was on anxiety medication. I got off of it about 3 months before all this came out in the summer. And one day I came home and looked at my husband and said, I'm not okay, and I'm going back on the Paxil. So that helps keep me a little even. But we were doing Mass of Light Gloria at my church, and I was cantering weekly with very small crowds, but that was anxiety inducing enough. But we were doing Mass of Light Gloria, and I told my music director what had happened, and he didn't have time to switch things out yet. So it took him 2 or 3 weeks before we switched out the Glorias. But there was one Sunday when I had a panic attack in the middle of cantering the psalm. And it's the totality of it all. It's the knowing, and I know now, none of this was my fault. But initially the reaction is, well, maybe if I had come forward. But then you see all these women who came forward to the church, to the publishers, to their friends, to their families, to their priest, and nobody did anything. I tried to tell a friend once, and she went, oh, you're one of David's girls. So I stopped telling my friend or any other friends, because that was rough. I love her to death, and she would never hurt me intentionally, but that stung. And so in that Mass that I had the panic attack, and then I looked at my music director after Mass, and I'm sorry, I was having a panic attack. And he's like, well, what caused that? And so I told him. And then even as recently as early December, he accidentally scheduled one of David's songs thinking it was Marty's. And I said, all right, I'm going to do it because we've got the worship aid is ready. And he said, but let's not do this again. And I got through it, and it was hard. And I looked at him after and I said, when you ask me to sing his music, you're putting his voice in my head. Because for those of us who listened to his music over the years or went to his concerts, you hear his voice in your head, and that's what you're asking. And the thing is with only 50 of us who've come forward, and knowing that there's probably for every one of us at least 3 or 4 or more, you don't know when you schedule his music if the cantor you're asking is a survivor, or the woman next to you, you don't know, because so many of us have not been able to come forward.
Thank you for sharing all of that, Margaret. We are really grateful for that. I want to bring Laurie into the conversation now. So Laurie, you worked with David Haas at Music Ministry Alive, his camp. So how did you get connected with Margaret and with the other survivors? Why did you want to help? Oh, you're muted still.
Wait, okay, there we go. I was contacted by a friend who's also someone in the music world to let me know about this email that went out. He was one of the people that received it. And I honestly wasn't particularly surprised. I mean, they're shocked, but they're sort of not surprising. I'm a survivor of childhood sexual abuse as well. And so I know how important it is for survivors to be believed and to be heard, and how important that is in the process of healing. And so I wanted to do what I could do to help give voice to these survivors. And I also wanted to do everything possible to get the word out about this, because I was absolutely certain there were other victims. And so I posted a number of things on my Facebook page. I'm still in contact with a lot of people in the youth ministry world, and just shared what I knew, as well as my own experience as a survivor and why it's so important to believe victims. And within the first day, I started getting direct messages from complete strangers, saying, "Thank you for posting this. I'm one of the victims. I don't know what to do." I got messages from friends of victims saying, "My friend has shared this with me. I don't know what to do to support her. How can I support her?" So there was a domino effect, and I just started reaching out to provide whatever kind of support, and then in hopes that I would be able to encourage each one of these women to get in touch with Stephanie, because I thought it was really important for them to be able to give voice, whether that was in writing or in a conversation with Stephanie. And I thought it would be incredibly important for them to know they were not alone, and that there was an opportunity somewhere down the line to meet one another. Because I think one thing that survivors often think is that they're the only one. And so we don't tell because we don't think we'll be believed, or in Margaret's case, there's a snide remark or something that's super hurtful. We just really don't believe that it could be happening or could have happened to more than one person. And so that sense of isolation, can exist for years and decades. So eventually I got on a call with Stephanie and just said, "This is who I am. I want to share with you what my experience was working with David at Music Ministry Alive, and why I disconnected from working with him. And then I want to know what I can do. How can I help?" And so at that time, Stephanie was getting daily reports, multiple reports. I don't know how she managed that on a daily basis, but there was just an admin stuff that needed to be done. Contacting dioceses to say, "We've got a report from somebody saying that, abuse happened in your diocese," and as well as trying to contact all dioceses in the country to let them know about what was going on. And so I said, "Sure, let me jump in." And so Stephanie connected Margaret and I, and we started working on a game plan to get some kind of communication out to every bishop in the country.
So that's amazing. Can you tell us more about what you've done, and what about those letters to dioceses, and what kind of response you've gotten?
Sure. So in July, Margaret and I worked on drafting a email to all the bishops. Margaret had already contacted her own bishop in her diocese, and we used that letter as a basis for a general email. We spent quite a bit of time trying to track down email addresses for every bishop, as well as every liturgical and music ministry office in a diocese. So, because we wanted those emails to go out directly, as if they wouldn't want it to be a big chain email. So the first email was just simply, making them aware of the communication that went out from Stephanie and her team. And then we also highlighted the fact that the Diocese of San Jose in California had already made a decision to ban his music. And we asked them to follow suit and do the same, and explained why, that survivors were asking for that. And, his music was traumatizing. And also we didn't like the fact that he was making money, off of his music, the very music that he used to harm women. And so that email went off. I got a few responses, maybe a handful, a few bishops that immediately said, yes, we're going to pull his music, but not a whole lot. And so we kind of went back to the drawing board, and I asked Margaret and another survivor if they would be willing to include their name in the next correspondence, because we felt like an email from two survivors would be pretty impactful. We couldn't imagine that a bishop or a diocesan director would ignore an email from survivors. And so, I set up a new email account and send that off on behalf of the two of them. We definitely got better response. Some responses from bishops were, very pastoral. Some responses were hideous. I mean, just downright painful and incredibly insensitive. They were not getting the emails. Margaret and Susan were not getting the emails. Hey, sorry. So I was able to filter those because I didn't want them getting, any of that kind of negativity. So, sorry, stop. So again, I think I guess it was September maybe, then when the Into Account report came out, and we decided we would send yet another email to any bishops that hadn't responded to us. And, outlining that the report had come out from Into Account, noting what kind of information they could find, and again, asking them to be in solidarity with survivors and to ban the music. In all three cases, I also sent a follow-up email 2 weeks later saying, could you respond, please? I'm requesting a response. Thus far, we have a little over 70 dioceses that have contacted us back and have made a decision to no longer use his music. We have some bishops who've come back and said they're waiting for the results of investigations, although we don't really know what investigations they're talking about or how they would obtain any information. A lot of them referred back to Minneapolis and saying they were waiting for the results of Minneapolis, even though Minneapolis had already made the decision not to use his music. And then sadly, probably a third of the remaining dioceses, the bishop never contacted us at all. And sadly, the Archdiocese in Milwaukee is one of those dioceses. I made a really strong effort for large archdioceses because I found that smaller dioceses within those regions were often following whatever an archdiocese would do. And so in our third email to the archdiocese, I sent a letter to the chancellor, an email to the chancellor, the bishop, the liturgy director, the music director, and I also CC'd it to all of the local newspapers in Milwaukee, and we still heard nothing back.
Wow. Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you for describing that for us. So 6 emails, and we know we have people on this call from dioceses all over the country, but those of us from the Archdiocese of Milwaukee, you've never heard any response from anyone. Well, thank you for describing that process and for being willing to step up. And it sounds like you did a lot of work to make all of this happen as well. And I know that's really appreciated by everyone. Now that we've had a chance to have Laurie and Margaret and Stephanie all share a little bit, there's just a few more questions I kind of wanted to raise to all of you. And maybe this one's for Laurie and Margaret. So maybe Laurie, since you're on, you want to start. But what would you say to those people who believe the allegations, think this is true, but think that we can separate David Haase's behavior from his music, the music that they still enjoy and they want to use? What would you say to people who feel that way about it?
I would say their enjoyment should not be their first concern. Their first concern should be these women who have been harmed by this man. I get it. I played, lots of David's music. I sang as well in my church, lots of David's music. I've sang them at family funerals. So I understand that personal connection to his songs. But for me, it was more important to be in solidarity with these women than it was to have to wipe out, my whole collection of his stuff. I think we have to look at what the priority is, and the priority shouldn't be, well, I like his music. The priority should be this man intentionally used his music for 4 decades to manipulate and harm women. And if we can look at it that way, there is no justification for singing his music ever again. And as I said as well, he made his living off of this music. At the same time, he made these women's lives hell. And I don't want to see him get another dime. I don't think he deserves that. And this may be one of the few consequences that David experiences from the harm that he's done. And so I would just say that we have to put victims, survivors at the forefront. We always have to do that. And honestly, as a church, we've not done that well. We haven't done it well in the sexual abuse by priest. And it's just time for us to say victims and survivors have to be at the forefront of the decisions we make about these kind of issues.
Thank you. Margaret, is there anything you would like to add to that?
Yeah, I was saying before that, it could be like your cantor, it could be the lady sitting next to you. It could also be one of your friends and you don't know. And, if a priest is credibly accused of misconduct and removed from ministry, nobody expects or asks the survivors to read his homilies in Mass.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody expects the survivors to sit and listen while somebody else reads them. He used the music to gain access, mm-hmm. power, and influence over many, many, I would argue pretty much all of the survivors. So the question that somebody who feels like they must have this music is why you would want something with those connotations. Mm-hmm. Why you would want to take that risk.
Margaret, I would also say that for other survivors of sexual abuse who know about this, for me now, certainly I had a personal connection with David, but for me, there are my own triggers now. Mm-hmm. By the idea that my church is continuing to, they've acknowledged, they say they believe women, but they're not doing anything about it. And so it leaves all survivors in a place of like, well, they say they believe me, but do they really? And so then we go back and start questioning ourselves. Mm-hmm. And so yes, certainly at the forefront are his victims, but anybody who has had an experience of or who's living, surviving from sexual abuse can be triggered by this whole entire situation.
Mhm. As music ministers, we are weaving the music that we present to people, that we present in mass, into the very fabric of people's lives. When you're doing a song and somebody chooses it for their wedding, for their funeral, you're making that have a presence. You're putting that composer in a position of leadership in people's lives. You are serving it to them. So think about what you would serve to your guests in the Lord's house. And if this is what you want to serve, and it's particularly a problem in the diocese where there hasn't been enough publicity because people don't know.
Thank you. Those are really powerful statements from both of you. Thank you. We're going to switch to question and answer in just a few minutes because I know we're getting questions from the audience, but I wanted to ask one more thing of you, Stephanie, because it came up in the chat and it's something that you mentioned earlier. I think a lot of people have this question. Okay, so if we know he committed, so many decades of abuse, we have all these survivor stories. Why isn't he in jail? Why is there not criminal prosecution? And I've heard some people say, well, shouldn't we wait until, there's been a trial and he's been convicted? So can you maybe speak a little bit to that and whether, what you think about that?
Yeah, those are really good questions. And I'm going to try to be as concise as I can. I warned everyone at Awake Milwaukee ahead of time that I can go on and on about this particular question because there's so many facets to it. I mean, one of the simplest answers are that statutes of limitations are really quite short, particularly for sexual assault committed against adults. And one thing that I think is really important to understand about David Haas, which makes him very similar to lots and lots of perpetrators of sexual abuse, is that he got very good at not getting caught. And he got very good at doing things that were less likely to get him in trouble with the law. So, we can't state anything for certain because we're only working on the reports that we've gotten. But we do think that he learned not to rape. I mean, to put it bluntly, that he learned to coerce something that he could then identify as consent, even if the circumstances were not remotely conducive to a survivor having, to a woman having that kind of power to say no. When women did say no, he punished them with extreme anger and sometimes with professional consequences. So I'm not saying that he didn't do things that are illegal. He did. I have many things that have been reported to me are illegal. From rape to stalking to sexual battery, which is basically, any sexual contact that is not consensual to a person over 18. He learned to groom teenagers and wait until they turned 18 to sexually assault them. That's also a very common pattern among perpetrators like him. So he lessened the possibility of people having experiences that the police would take seriously. Now, the other thing that you have to remember, there's one overarching thing that I want to say about this question, which is that it still comes down to survivors' choices. And the minute you decide to interface with law enforcement and the criminal justice system, you lose significant control over what happens next. And that is why the vast majority of survivors don't choose to do this. It can feel like pardon my language, it can feel like kind of a crapshoot as to whether you get law enforcement who are sympathetic to survivors, who are trained enough in sex crimes that they know not to dismiss things that are dismissed in popular culture. But even then, I've helped many survivors make police reports. Even once you make a police report, you can say that you made a police report, and people have made police reports, but to get the attention of a prosecutor, you have to have, a lot of prosecutors won't pick up cases that they don't think they can win. And here we've got a case where we have 50 victims who have a whole range of things that have happened to them, from rape and things that I think could be tried as criminal sexual child abuse, to online harassment, which can be absolutely devastating, but which is very, especially if you're not a minor, it's very hard to get law enforcement to take it seriously. And it may not be technically illegal in some cases. It just really depends. So, I mean, one answer is it's going to the cops and saying, this person 10 years ago stuck his tongue down my throat and put his hand down my pants. It's very unlikely to lead somewhere. So there are a lot of women who are in that position. In terms of, some people are asking about civil suits, class action suits. I'm actually not comfortable saying very much about that. That's we're not done with this story. But I will say that committing to civil, if you get a lawyer who's willing to represent you, and in civil suits, lawyers tend to choose cases that they think they can win. Statutes of limitations are relevant in civil suits too, sometimes. And also, it's very hard emotionally for survivors to go through those things. That's the thing I always want people to remember when you ask these questions. You're asking a lot of survivors. These are the, cases that are criminally convicted get the media attention, big lawsuits get the media attention. And those things are really important. I would like to see some of that kind of accountability in this case, but we can't count on it. And, to say that when we have reports from this many people, and even if it weren't this many people, but we don't have to take any action, and we can pretend that this doesn't exist as long as there isn't a successful civil case or a successful criminal case. When you make that assertion, you're basically saying that most of the sexual abuse and sexual violence that happens in the world, you don't have to be concerned with, because the vast majority of it will never reach those levels of accountability for all kinds of reasons. One of the things that particularly gets in my craw is when dioceses, as I can't remember if it was Margaret or Laurie who mentioned that dioceses will talk about waiting to hear the results of the investigation. Well, there are about 5 different investigations that are ongoing or have already happened in relation to this case. The LA Archdiocese has one, Minneapolis St. Paul has one, St. Catherine University has one. And none of these entities are under any obligation to share their information with the public. And so the likelihood of there being a big investigation that tells you a whole bunch of things, and now you can be like, we know the truth, that's unlikely to happen. The closest you might get is the Into Account report, because it's based on the testimonies of almost 50 women. But yeah, I mean, I think to people who are, I think most of the people on this call asking that question are just like, what do we do about this guy? And unfortunately, I don't think the criminal justice system is going to save us, even if this does end up in a criminal court. I don't think the civil system is going to save us, even if that it goes, in that direction. It may be, I would hope that it could bring justice for one particular survivor, but even that is a really open question, because these systems are built to make survivors go away. They aren't built for justice. David Haas is, I'm almost done here, I promise. I told you I could go on and on about this one, but David Haas is in an incredibly privileged position as a person who has been accused of multiple sex crimes. He is white. He is famous. He is religious. He just has a ton of privilege. With that said, the accountability that has been brought to him is significant. It has disrupted his ability to get access to victims. When GIA stopped publishing his music, and when dioceses said they weren't going to have his music performed anymore, I mean, he has been preying on women by going to conferences and, showcasing his new music for decades now, and he can't do that anymore, which is what makes me think he's probably on the internet with an alternate identity, preying on women that way, because we just have the way to bring accountability when the criminal and civil systems aren't there for you is by curtailing access to victims. And I think that, that's going to be a reality for people in Catholic liturgical music for as long as this man is still alive.
Thank you. Thanks for speaking about that with so much passion. We really appreciate the information about that, because I think it's something that a lot of people don't really fully understand. So we want to take some time now to take some questions. Erin has been collecting them from people, and we only have about 10 more minutes for questions, but we want to make sure that we raise some of those. So I'm going to let Erin take over from here.
Yeah, thanks to everyone who has submitted questions this evening. Stephanie, I'm going to ask you to consider another big question here. You touched on it before, but I was just wondering if you could sort of go back to this question. How was David Haas allowed to continue unchecked for 4 decades? What made this possible?
Yeah, well, I'm pulling up an actual copy of our report because there's so many, there are so many reasons why he got away with it. One overarching one is that he chose his victims with a great deal of skill. He chose people who were traumatized as kids, often, people who had already been sexually abused. One of in fact, the biggest risk factor for being a victim of sexual abuse is that you've already been a victim of sexual abuse in the past. Perpetrators know that as well as anybody. And it allows people who perhaps didn't ever learn how to protect their own boundaries because trusted people took that ability away from them. He knew how to find people like that. Another reason is that he was in a spiritual system that just really denigrated girls and women, and he knew that and he exploited it. There is so much policing, and there's so much attention to the sexuality of teenage girls in church cultures in general, certainly in Catholicism and just across the board. We teach girls very early to assume that they are responsible for anything that a man might do to them. Men are conceived to be like out of control of their own sexuality, and women are the ones who are supposed to corral unbridled male sexuality. And when women are violated by men, then a cultural and spiritual logic can be, well, she must have done something to make it impossible for him to resist doing that. That's a factor in many, many sexual abuse cases. Certainly when survivors report to me things that David Haas said to them, I will see how evident it was that he was exploiting that discourse for himself. Another thing is that he was just so powerful in these industries. You know, he was one of the most widely published Catholic liturgical composers. He is instrumental in post-Vatican II hymnody in a way that I certainly can't appreciate as a non-Catholic, but I know is a big deal. I think it was, people just always weighed the contributions he was making versus the lives of his victims, and always valued the contributions he was making over the lives of the victims, even when he was using those contributions as a way to access more victims. I want to read.
Hey, Steph, I think the other thing that would be important to note too is that David never had an employer. So a lot of people had no idea who they could report to. You know, if something happens in the workplace, we know we can go to HR, but David didn't work for anybody. He worked for himself. So even though there were people who had concerns, even for me, my concerns about what was happening at Music Ministry Alive, there was no place for me to take it.
Mm-hmm.
It was his program. I brought the concerns to him. I brought the concerns to other people on the team. But so I think that in some ways, if there were people who did try and they were ignored, but there were other people who just like, I don't know what to do. I don't know where else to go, because he is accountable to no one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, one overarching authority that could have held him accountable was the church, and the church did not, even after multiple reports. I'm noticing, I don't have a lot of time to read the chat, but I'm noticing people are mentioning GIA quite a bit. And of course, he's a contractor everywhere, so that's part of the problem. But GIA would be maybe one other place where he's as close as you can get to an employee. GIA is a family company. That's one really important thing to remember about GIA. Family company means frequently doesn't have an HR department. I think they're working on that now, but you know, I had many women tell me, well, the person to contact is the CEO of the company. Well, the CEO of the company, you know, 2 generations of CEOs of that company have been close friends of his and have been very susceptible to his manipulation. So that's another problem. Like, the people who could hold him accountable, you know, he cultivated relationships with. He also surrounded himself with abusers. He surrounded himself with people who have sexual secrets. Not all of them were abuse, but, you know, infidelity. The church's anti-LGBT stance made it really easy for him to hold the threat of outing people over people's heads. He did that. He collected information on people's relationships, and he used that when he needed to protect himself. And also, he just was very masterful at spiritual. I'm using all this in the past tense. I think he's still capable of all of these things. So keep denying him access. But also just very capable of spiritual manipulation, of first making people feel really, really special, and he wrote songs for many of the women that he victimized. And the act of writing the songs was sometimes grooming, sometimes a method of silencing them. He just was very skilled at manipulating the spiritual authority that he was given. And then when he did get caught, he was also very capable of using I'm a broken sinner who is now like, I'm on a journey of redemption language. So he could deploy power when it made sense to behave in a domineering fashion. He could do that. When it made sense to say, hey, wait a minute, I'm just a sinner. I'm no saint. I'm working on myself just like everyone else. And like, God loves me, a poor, pathetic sinner. He could spin that discourse as well, and did so very skillfully, and was allowed to do it. So that's a whole bunch of reasons why I think this went on for so long.
Stephanie, thank you for sharing these insights. They're sort of deep level insights that I appreciate you for sharing. Margaret, I wanted to ask you a question that came from the audience tonight. Beyond responding to this specific case, speaking as a survivor, and I don't want to put you in the position of speaking for all survivors, but just in your experience, what else could the average Catholic do to make the church safer, support survivors better? What could we do?
I think the most important thing that the church can do for all survivors is to stop making us do all the heavy lifting. We are, in this case, wandering around, writing the letters, talking to people, often being hit with stone walls, having to deal with people who are, well, what about this funeral? It means a lot. I sing at a lot of funerals, and I have to say, this is one point I wanted to make, because I in Florida, you have a lot of funerals, and I sing at a lot of them. And my bishop, fortunately, put a moratorium on the music, but occasionally I'll still get a request. And all I've had to say is, our bishop has asked us not to do this music. Could we choose another song? Or I'll say, Mr. Haas has had some issues and we're not singing his music. And they go, okay, and then they'll pick another one of the top 10 funeral hymns. It's never been an issue. Stop asking us to do the heavy lifting. Stop saying, but the music is so pretty. Why is that more important than a 13-year-old that was assaulted? Why is that more important than, and not even just Haas survivors, but any survivor? If, Jack and Jill were caught counting the money, pocketing money, but they were really nice people and they did it for 40 years, you wouldn't say, well, but Jill makes the best, fruitcake, so we need to keep her around. You would just stop having them count the money. And it wouldn't take 50 people to say, I saw them pocketing the money. It would take one, maybe two. But in issues of sexual assault, 50 women aren't enough, because we have to have an investigation. We are church, and we need to do better. I'm saying this as a woman, as a Catholic, as a cantor, not just as a survivor. We need to do better for people who are suffering, or we're just playing lip service.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you. I would like to actually ask, I think we're almost out of time here, but I'm going to ask one more question. Laurie, this is something that we talked a little bit about before this evening. Some of the people here this evening are not music ministers. They're not survivors themselves. I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit about why they should care about this story, about this situation. Why does it matter whether David Haase's music is sung at Mass or not?
It has to matter, because these women have experienced a tremendous amount of trauma. They've been to hell and back because of what he did to them. And for us not to stand up and say that this is not okay, and our church can do better at caring for anyone who is harmed in this way. For so many years, sometimes decades, sometimes lifetimes, survivors remain silent. And that silence can't continue. We need to be able to give them voice and then be their voice, so that they don't feel like they are alone. So they don't feel like they have to walk away from a church or a community that they love because they don't feel supported. I think when you put all of it in perspective and you put the victims of sexual abuse at the forefront, there really is no other choice but to stand up and stand with them. I want to just read something I wrote earlier, just because I need to read it because I'm not sure I can get through it any other way. But I think this really captures what is necessary for we as a people of God, for we as people who proclaim Jesus as our Savior, need to be doing for anybody who is harmed in this way. Each of you play a significant role in the healing of survivors, all survivors, in fact. When you speak out for survivors, you are saying that their pain is real and it matters, that you are willing to walk this journey with those survivors, even if it hurts you as well, that survivors are worthy of a life of healing and wholeness, that you will not tolerate a church where any woman, any person lives in fear, that when one member of the body of the church suffers, we all suffer, that abuse is never, never okay, that every man, woman, and child is entitled to live lives free of this horrific pain. Survivors need your voice because their voices have been silenced for way too long. They need you to believe them and fight for them because for too long, no one has.
Thank you, Laurie. I think this is a good moment to stop our questions and move on to our final step. We're going to move on now to Patty and Greeley, who is a member of the Awake leadership team. And Patty's going to talk a little bit with us this evening about some action steps for all of us based on what we heard this evening. And I just want to, before I pass to Patty, I just want to ask one quick question of Laurie and Margaret. At this point, is there anything available that that's public that shares what you've learned from, about which dioceses have said, yes, they won't play his music? Like, is there a place anywhere where the public can get access to that information?
Yeah, in fact, Sarah and I emailed about that yesterday, and I sent her a copy of each of the emails that went out. And then there's a Google spreadsheet that we created. It's not pretty, but it lists all of the dioceses that responded and what their response was. And then you'll also see on that spreadsheet dioceses that never responded. So I think Sarah's going to make those available to folks.
And I might have stolen the thunder, but I had got several questions about that this evening from audience. So I just wanted to make sure that was asked. So Patty, I'm going to pass the mic to you. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Erin. Now that we've taken the time to really listen to these stories, and you probably have, a lot of emotion that you're personally feeling, I think kind of to echo the words that were said earlier, we really do need to stop making the survivors do the heavy lifting for us. We all need to step into this uncomfortable conversation and make our voices amplify their voices because they should not have to do this alone. And so we'll kind of spend the next few minutes going through, a couple of action steps that you can take. I know this topic had become more real to me this fall. I was at a funeral and it had one of David Haase's songs had been played. And during that time, I couldn't sing. Thankfully, it was a funeral, so tears were an appropriate reaction. But it just reminded me of how, even though I wasn't personally impacted, I didn't know any of the survivors. I couldn't imagine if I had been a survivor there, hearing the music, hearing the songs, knowing that that man who wrote those words, whose name was being published, was still allowed to continue to have his music published and played. And so I think that that's why I feel so passionately about the mission of Awake, and why I know that it often may feel like there's little that the average Catholic can do to improve the Catholic Church's response to sexual abuse, but also there are some clear and simple steps that all of us do so we can make the church clear that we want our church to prioritize the safety and healing of all survivors and to all of their families. We would first encourage you to share this conversation with others. As we had mentioned, it's been recorded, and so you may want to send the video or wait until next week's Awake blog post, which will also include a brief summary. Additionally, we have 2 really specific steps that we would like to have everybody kind of help make the church a safer place. First, if you are a member of the Catholic Church, please reach out directly to the music minister or the director of liturgy at your church. Ask them if they're aware of the revelations of David Haas. Send them the link to the recording and request that they discontinue the use of his music. We also know that public statements can make a huge difference in communicating the support to the survivors. So please ask them to make a clear statement to the parish about why they've stopped using the music. It can be put into the bulletin, it can be mentioned at Mass, but share why it's so important that we all really do need to stop making the survivors do the heavy lifting and help amplify their voices. Your voice might be the difference that makes the difference in ensuring that those who are attending Mass at your parish aren't caused additional pain to those who've been harmed. Second, and as you heard Laurie talk about the fact that the Milwaukee Archdiocese hasn't responded, if you are in the Archdiocese of Milwaukee, please contact the Archdiocesan leadership directly and ask them to suspend the use of David Haas's music in our Archdiocese. While many dioceses, as you've heard, have taken this action, when Awake raised this issue this fall, the response that we received indicated that some leaders didn't believe this was an issue that Catholics in our Archdiocese care about. So it's important to demonstrate that we do, in fact, care. We're again going to ask you to send an email to Archbishop Listecki and our auxiliary bishops sometime in the next week. We'll send you some ideas about what you might write, although we also encourage you to make the email personal and speak from your heart as far as in why this matters to you and why it's so important for all of us to take these steps. If you're in a different diocese, it should be pretty simple to find out if they've responded to this issue in any way. Let's really help with that heavy lifting and help amplify all of the voices to really improve the church's overall response to sexual abuse. There's some clear, simple steps that we can all take to make sure that our church prioritizes the healing and safety of all of our survivors. Finally, moving on to more of the announcements part of it, thank you tonight so much for being here. We'll send you an email tomorrow morning, including a survey asking for your feedback about tonight and suggestions for future topics and speakers related to the twin crisis of sexual abuse and leadership failures in the Catholic Church. Please take a few minutes to help and complete that survey. It does only take a few minutes, but trust us, that really does help us generate quite a few of ideas. Awake is always looking for volunteers to help partner in our mission. So if you're interested in assisting with future courageous conversations or our response to David Haas's situation, or helping your parish become more survivor sensitive, offering your financial support, or getting involved with other aspects of our mission, we would love to hear from you. Finally, our next part of the Courageous Conversations speaker series will be on the third Thursday of every month. So we hope that you can join us, mark your calendars now, for February 18th. I know this is one that I'm really excited about to sort of learn how to put it into practice at our parish. Our guest speaker will be Dr. Stephen Sanders, a professor of psychology at Marquette University, who will discuss the impacts of trauma and offer concrete guidance of how Catholics can build more trauma-sensitive parishes that are welcoming and supportive of all abuse survivors. Please watch your email for the link to sign up. In closing, I'm going to hand it over to Jerry so she can close us in prayer.
Yes, thank you so much, Patty. Please join me in prayer any way you feel comfortable. I'm going to just pray in the way I always do, in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Lord, thank you so much for Margaret, Stephanie, and Laurie. Thank you for all that they've shared and the lives that they've lived. Lord, they are an example to move forward in the future. Please help us to do the heavy lifting that Margaret told us about. Please help us to take Laurie's words seriously, and please help us to mirror Stephanie's courage. Thank you, Lord, for all you provide for us. Please let us be your hands on earth. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen.